Good morning. My name is Jane Brennom, and I am the chair of the St. David's Partnership and Child Welfare Ministry team here at Westminster. Today's Social Justice Forum is being co-hosted by the Social Justice Forum team and our team. This year's Social Justice Forum are built around the common theme of diving deeper together so all will flourish. This theme builds on our heightened awareness of the systemic and critical issues affecting our community, brought to greater attention in recent years by the murder of George Floyd. Through these forums, we are learning about long-standing needs and becoming more prepared to support the flourishing of all members of our community. Today, we are pleased to welcome Lisa Brennom and, we believe, Dianne Haulcy. She's being held up. They will be discussing how the pandemics of COVID-19 and racism have impacted the youngest members of our community and their families. Lisa Brennom currently serves as the Senior Director of the St. David's Harman Center, which is housed here at Westminster on the second floor of our new addition. And they have been located here since it opened in 2018. At the Harman Center, services are given to the children who are 6 years of age and younger, and their families. In her current position here at the Harman Center, Lisa is responsible for the clinical and administrative elements of programming for the Harman Center's day treatment and rehabilitation programs. She has 20 years of direct practice experience and has managed a variety of early intervention and mental health programs for children and their families in our community. She is passionate about the value of early intervention and believes strongly in the power of reparative relationships. She has worked at St. David's Center for Child and Family Development since 2009, serving as an outpatient mental health therapist, a mental health consultant to teachers and administrators in preschool settings, a day treatment therapist, and the director of Family Place, St. David's Day Treatment Program. And we are hoping that Dianne Haulcy will be joining us. Dianne is the Senior Vice President for Family Engagement at Think Small, a Twin Cities nonprofit that works to improve quality care and education for young children. She is also the host of Early Risers, a podcast from Little Moments Count with NPR about raising children with a clear understanding of anti-racism, cultural differences, and implicit bias. Some of you who are NPR listeners may have heard her in recent months in conversation with Kathy Wurzer, on whose program she has appeared. And additionally to Westminster members, she's an active member of Liberty Church, which is our longtime partner in North Minneapolis. A couple of short notes for the audience. For those attending in person here in the Meisel Room, raise your hand and we will bring a microphone to you so all, including those who are participating on live stream, can hear your question or comment. For those attending on the live stream, please submit your comment or question in the live stream chat, and we'll monitor and read your question and or comment. And now we will begin a conversation, we hope, between Lisa and Dianne. The first question that we will be addressing, and we'll have Lisa respond. Here's the first question: how have the circumstances of COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the killing of George Floyd affected children and families in our community? And Lisa will be directing her comments to specifically the children and families with whom she and the staff at the Harman Center are currently working. Thank you. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Diane. I hope that it's not just a conversation with me as well, and that we have other folks that'll be willing to engage with me. This is just my lens, and I'm looking for this to be a learning opportunity as well as one where we can both just share information with each other. It's such a big question. How have our families been impacted? I feel like we are living in the middle of a history book chapter right now, and all of us are living so close to it that we can't see what some of the impacts are. We can't see what the outcomes will be, and we can only kind of wonder what will be written in 20 years. So it feels like such a big question. I struggled to, sift down what would be most important for people to learn. I think something that we can agree on, and I love to find things that people can agree on these days, is that children's development has been disrupted across the board, across all families, across all communities. When we serve families who are already in a place of vulnerability at St. David's Center, and they've come to us for assistance with relationship issues, for an autism spectrum disorder, for a mental health disorder, they are already in a place of vulnerability. And when you add a global pandemic that none of us have ever experienced, and you add a racial reckoning in our country around race and equity in our communities and in our families, the pressure has been even greater for our families to figure out how to survive and where to come up for air. I think that's something that we know about development that stays true and the same is that children need relationship to development. And relationship is the primary vehicle for which all children create change for themselves and move forward. And what we know about our time right now is that all relationships for kids have been inconsistent and disrupted. And what kids need are consistency, structure, and routine, and nothing has been the same for 2 years. And so all of us are in the midst of this delay in development and trying to figure out how we can move forward. I think safety is a huge issue that we manage as a community at St. David's. When people don't feel safe, when we don't feel safe as adults, when kids don't feel safe, we're preoccupied. When our parents don't feel safe, they're preoccupied. Not because they don't want to meet every single developmental need that their child is having, but they have other things that are basic needs as well that they're preoccupied with, whether that be neighborhood safety, food, housing safety, instability in any other way. And so all of these things get compounded, and we focus on at St. David's the relationship and what we can do in our tiny little community to be as consistent and structured and routined so that there's some place they can go where safety isn't as big an issue. I was hoping at this point Diane would chime in with a larger theme.
If I could just ask a question to give context, since Diane isn't, we hope there's nothing wrong. Can you give us and give the audience a general idea of the number of children and their families that you are serving here at the Harman Center? And if those numbers changed in any way as a result of the initial, the closing of services, and where we are today.
Sure. So we have approximately 50 to 75, including some of our in-home services as well, potentially up to 100. Just out of this site alone. Has that changed? No, we have done our best to stay up and running. regardless of what's going on in the community, hoping to provide that safe and secure base for families to come back to. Should we go on to the second question?
What I would, the next question is, how have providers of services to children and families had to change as a result of the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and racism?
I decided to give an example of my own learning during this time, my lens and my learning. After the murder of George Floyd, and especially during Derek Chauvin's trial, I had a lot of concern around safety. All of our services are happening downtown. And so there were a lot of things happening downtown. There was a lot of new people. There were unknown people. There were protests. There were things happening around our community that I was trying desperately to keep a handle of, and to understand if we could safely serve kids on site here downtown. And so I had joined some community groups, and I was keeping an eye on traffic cams, and I was, assessing people all across the community to make this, what I thought would be a wise decision for our staff and clients. And early on, I had made the decision that, yes, I think we can be open. I've talked to enough people. I've looked at enough things online. I think that we can safely open and invite kids and parents in. And I received a phone call from one of my program directors, Megan Weber, and she said, "Lisa, our staff don't feel safe coming to work today." And I had such an immediate feeling of relief that I had the right answer. And for myself, how simple that would have been had I just asked my staff of color how they feel about coming downtown to come to work today. And so that answer has been easier for me to assess and do right as a result of that simple learning, that no matter what I did from my lens as a white leader downtown, it wasn't enough. And so having staff that are willing to talk to their managers about what they feel safe doing has been really helpful to me. We have a question.
Yeah, just related to that, that was really interesting, your comment about your staff. Could you comment on what you've heard from parents, too?
Oh, that's a big question. Many of our kids are driven to their day treatment programs in medical transportation vans that are driven by mainly people of color. And often they're not the same people who drive their kids every day, and they often take different routes. And so it's been a huge issue for us in our work with transportation companies and our work with health insurance companies to say, this is the kind of safety and support we need to help our kids get here safely. Does that make sense and answer the question? Yeah, it's been a real challenge for our parents right now.
Maureen Walsh, who works very closely with our St. David's partnership team here, relayed a story. I think she was the one that relayed the story about the mother who has a child receiving services here at the Harman Center, who was an Uber driver and was doing another job, which if we follow the news at all, we know from everything that it is the most vulnerable people who are economically vulnerable, and that's disproportionately people of color who have felt the worst impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, not to mention the ongoing racism in our society. But she described a story where the mom wanted to keep the child, but the only place that she could figure out a time that she could meet with the mental health therapist for her child was pulling up at a drive-in food place. that is not an unusual story, I suspect.
No.
Can you give other examples of the stresses, the real-life stresses that families are experiencing who have economic, mental health, trauma, all of these things that are going through, and that's a combination of COVID-19
Right.
and racism. Thank you.
It's not unusual for our staff to meet with families wherever they are, whether that be in their home, in the car during a break from work, in a cafeteria somewhere. For me to even try to contemplate what it's like to parent young children right now, all my children are grown, I feel grateful. But the constant juggling of how to prioritize, do I go to work? Do I teach my child over Zoom? Do I try to get them to treatment? Do I have enough food on the table right now? There are many, many examples of how we're trying to meet parents where they are during this constant juggling that they're having to do.
And because a lot of our audience probably is not as familiar with what Family Place, the day treatment program at the St. David's Center offers, they're not as familiar perhaps with what mental health therapy for a child under the age of 6 might entail. Can you give the audience perhaps some other examples of the challenges that would bring a child and his family to need these services?
We have a mental health day treatment program, and then we have an autism day treatment program as well. And for our mental health day treatment program, most of the children who come to services have experienced some kind of early childhood trauma, most often in relationship with a primary caregiver, or an involvement with a system like child protection, or potentially they are in a placement with a foster family. What that early childhood disruption looks like is delayed development, that they don't have the stable, secure base from which to grow any further. And so what treatment looks like is structured routines on a daily basis that are where we're giving the same messages during the same time frame every single day. Kids come to us for 12 months, and so we see them for 3 hours a day. We give them predictable responses. We wonder about their behavior and get curious about their behavior rather than judging it. If you have a child who's disruptive or acting out, we wonder why. We don't just look at that behavior. We wonder about what feeling is underneath that behavior rather than judging it and trying to fix it. We sit with them in it. So that's what treatment looks like. It's a lot of playing on the floor. It's a lot of following their lead and giving them some power and letting us adults know what's missing.
Just a quick comment that came in from the chat. Could you move the mic closer because not everybody can hear you?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes.
Diane has arrived, and
We are so pleased.
we are so thrilled. We will give her a moment to just settle in, and we will tell.
That's great. If there was a question that I was supposed to answer that someone didn't get an answer about, could they comment as well so that I could know what I might be able to repeat or make more clear? Great.
Diane, we are glad you're here.
We are.
And as I previously introduced Diane, so Diane, this was the first question that Lisa was engaging us with answers to, and we want to give you a chance because her work is in the greater community in the Twin Cities. We want her to give us the more global picture here in Minneapolis and St. Paul on the question of how have the circumstances of COVID-19 pandemic and the killing of George Floyd affected children and families in our community.
Excellent. First, I want to apologize for being late. There was a lot going on this morning, but I'm so grateful to be here and so thankful to have been invited to talk about this very important topic. So to answer that question is to also talk a little bit about how, which you may have already talked about, but a little bit about how trauma works. And trauma is something that gets lodged in our bodies. And for many people, there's all kinds of trauma, and some of it is good. And for many people, you may have a traumatic event, and then that's the event, and then there are things that happen that you are able to heal, and you're able to get back to normal. But for some people, that trauma never ends. And so in the event of the murder of George Floyd, we have to set that in context of hundreds of years of abuse by African Americans, in particular African American males, at the hands of the police or those that were deemed to protect us. And so what I think is particularly, there are many things that I think are particularly horrid about that event, but one of the things that sometimes I just can't get out of my mind is the fact that a young child was actually there witnessing the whole event. And so for other children to know this, and let's be honest, in our days of basically everything is in our hands, you know, children are seeing these things. There was a time when I was growing up, my mother didn't want me to see something, she just turned the TV off and say, don't turn it back on. Those days are over, and so children are seeing everything. And so they are witnessing this, and so the effects get lodged in our bodies. It's getting lots of questions about, from parents about how do I talk to my child about what's actually happened, because I don't even quite understand why it's happening myself. And so for many children, there's a bewilderment that happens, like I don't understand. And then for children of color, they get very fearful, because just imagine I am being taught that these are the people to protect me, yet I'm seeing that the people that look like me are getting harmed. So there's a lot that happens in that. And I will say that because of that, it's imperative that people talk to children about that. I know it's hard because sometimes we don't want to talk about it ourselves, but it's imperative that we talk about it because that's, for one, that's how the trauma begins to get out of our bodies. You know, that's one way. But also that children can begin to make sense of their world and begin to kind of put these pieces together to be able to form their own thoughts around what's happening to them.
We do a lot of that speaking into the silence.
Yes.
and not guessing what children need. If they're looking anxious or afraid, we're sitting with them and digging into that and wondering
Yes,
alongside them.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
If I could just ask a question. You have talked specifically about trauma, and we have immigrant children that are here in the program at the Harman Center because we have an East African autism program. How does the issue of inability to communicate as a first language English, or some of those issues, has any of that impacted how St. David's has had to interact on these dual issues? Because for some in the immigrant community, they've experienced trauma, their parents at least, in the country they have come from. Can you address that too?
We are blessed to have staff on site who are multilingual, and we don't have to rely on interpreters, which I feel is a blessing. I think some of our immigrant families that live in an immigrant community in Minneapolis have been able to use each other in ways that a lot of our white communities haven't been able to. They are already together. They are already doing something difficult and hard, and they already have each other's backs in it. And so I think that's something we could actually learn, that they're doing better than we are currently.
I wanted to follow up on a question, on a comment that you made about Dianne. I have a friend who grew up in Tulsa, and she talked about how her family did not talk about Greenwood and what happened. And I was just wondering, is that and she had actually, even though she's my age, she really didn't know all the details until later through school. Can you tell us how the not talking about trauma and how and what, if any, impact that might have had on seeing live the murder of George Floyd?
Oh, that's a really good question, actually. So you are correct. We don't like to talk, and there's many reasons why. It's painful, and that I get. But what happens when we don't talk about painful, traumatic events, especially those that are perhaps racialized or deal with other marginalized people, is that we don't. We create a society or a culture that just accepts these events as normal. So when you don't talk about it, then it can happen again, and people are unaware, and it further marginalizes people. And so what I think has happened with the technology now, for us being able to see all of these events that have been happening for a long time, is a bit of pulling back the curtain, if you will. So these are not events that have just popped up and started happening in 2020. But what's changed is the technology is there for everybody to see these events that are happening. And so, but even as we see them, there are still many that may choose not to really talk about it, you know what I mean? And so what happens again is that if we don't really dig in and talk about it, then we just accept that as the way things are, and we don't move towards changing things.
I think agree with you completely. I was thinking about, if we don't talk about it with our kids, then they fill in the blanks. Then
Yes.
they internalize.
That is absolutely true.
They internalize the anxiety or the feelings that they're picking up all around them. And if we don't fill the blanks in for them, then they're going to do it themselves, and typically not in a healthy developmental way.
Yes, very true. And what also they learn is that they can't talk about it either.
Absolutely.
And so they grow up knowing that this is not something that we discuss.
Dianne, Lisa, as you were arriving, had been asked the question, how have providers of services to children and families had to change because of these two pandemics? Can you give us some insights from your position at Think Small?
Yes, so I'll talk about the COVID-19 pandemic first. So first I want to say, we are at a period of time, I believe, in the pandemic where child care has been stretched really thin. And we are in a crisis, if you will. The child care business model was never great to begin with. And so we were already dealing with what we call child care deserts, where there are places where child care is just not available. And now, in the midst of this pandemic, it's gotten even more, more difficult. The one positive I will say is that Minnesota, outside of all of the countries in the United States, has actually prioritized child care in a way that has made some financial support to childcare. So since the pandemic started, childcare providers have been eligible for certain amounts of monthly support, which has done a lot to really help this field. So we are in a slightly better position than other states, I will say that, and I want to give credit to our governor for seeing that right off the bat. And with the new federal funds that are coming in, these supports will continue for a little while. So that's the good thing that's happening. The part that people are really struggling with is, quite frankly, staffing. So the numbers have gone, the ratios changed during the pandemic because of social distancing. And now people are, childcare providers are getting sick, just like everybody else. And so and some children are. And so when that happens, the whole place has to shut down. And then parents, oftentimes, many parents can't just stay home when their child care is not available. So they're having to find alternate care, which may or may not be good alternate care when that happens. And so childcare providers are really struggling. So I like to say, if you know a childcare provider in your life right now, please thank them, because they really are heroes. They really have been heroes throughout the pandemic. It's really been difficult for them. So that is the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still going on. I think with what's happened with George Floyd's murder, I will say that one thing I want to note is that, in the actual neighborhood in South Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered, there were many child care providers that were there. And actually some suffered somewhat with the uprising that happened afterwards and the fallout. Their actual physical locations, some had some damages to that. And so then I think we're talking about what we've already been talking about. How do you discuss these events in a child care setting, whether that be family child care or center-based? And I think a lot of programs have been, have had to deal with that on the fly. Like many parents, because once again, children are coming in and they're talking about it because they're seeing it. And so then you have to figure out a way to discuss it in a way that's developmentally appropriate and that does not, just push it away.
Can you give us some examples of some tips that you have given on NPR or other programs about how parents or any kind of a caregiver and teachers, some tips that really work for addressing these issues in a way that is culturally appropriate and gets away from, it challenges us who have implicit bias, and we are also, parents and caregivers who really want to be anti-racist.
That's a good question. So first I want to say we all have implicit bias. So that's all of us. And the one thing I always really want to hit home is that a child is never too young to have this conversation, because children are learning their biases very young. Children are not born racist, but they begin to learn very young. A child can learn, by the time a child is 6 to 9 months old, they're already recognizing a different race of a child than their provider. Their caregiver, their parent or caregiver. And so the important thing is to not shut the conversation down. So if a child has asked about race or points race out, they are ready for that conversation. That could happen as early as 2 or as soon as a child starts talking. And so the important thing is to engage that conversation. What stops people mostly is they feel like they don't have the right thing to say. And that may be true, but what I encourage people is don't worry about that so much, because what's most important is that you engage the conversation. Because if you get in your feelings, as the kids say, and you don't want to talk about it because you don't know what to say, what the child learns is, I can't talk about this. And then the conversation is shut down. But if you engage it, you actually are opening up a conversation for a lifetime. And so if you say, if the child is pointing something out, for instance, this is something we get a lot, if you will. Child points out another child's skin color is different than theirs. It's our bias that will put some judgment on that. The child is just noticing differences. That's how children develop. They develop by categorizing things. And so they're trying to learn and categorize and figure out which part do I put this in. And so engage in that conversation, and you've opened it up. One of the things you asked about the podcast, one of my favorite tips I like to give is when I was interviewing Louise Derman Sparks. She's the author of What If All the Kids Are White? She was a lifelong educator. She pulled out these dolls, which were beautiful, and she gave the doll, and they were all different races, and she gave each of the dolls names, and then she gave each doll a backstory, and then she said, now you could use this doll, and you could sit it in front of a child, and give the story, and she actually modeled like how you could use that doll in talking to a young child about what happened to George Floyd. And so, which was beautiful, and I'd never seen that before. And I love the idea of because that's how children learn too, through play. And so that was one of the tips that I like to talk about.
I want to make sure that we have enough time for people in the audience if they have questions. But I have another question for both of you. And that is, based on what you have learned, what conditions need to change so that all children in our community will flourish? And that can include policy changes, either at the state or county or federal level, and it can include funding and where we need to target our priorities. I'm going to start with Lisa, and then I'm going to go to Dianne.
I'm going to go even lower. I'm going to say individually, what can each of us do? And there are a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and practices and initiatives right now, and I think it's all really important for us to gain insight about who we are and what biases we have. I think what's even more important is doing something about that, is making a different decision in your life to address what you've discovered. Insight is helpful, but action is what we need. And that action can be whatever you decide for yourself that it is. But moving and doing something different feels really important. Have that conversation with the uncle during a family gathering where you know that he might have a different view that could be hurting somebody in your community. Have those small conversations with those that you love first, because it's going to be easier for you to have conversations with those in the community than later.
Very well said. Yeah, and what I would add to that is just that yes, there are definitely policies that and money is always needed. So I don't want to not say that. I mean, we always need more funding for these types of things, and we always need more funding in the area of early childhood. I will make a caveat to say, though, that there is some promise in the governor's budget, which I want to say is historic. The amount of funding that he has put towards early childhood in the governor's budget, I've never seen before. And so I just wanted to make that caveat. If that passes, we will be good. But I want to kind of piggyback on what you said, because I think that what is most important right now is that people take this on as a journey. already I think we are starting to feel fatigue for some people in having these conversations about race. And so, but really we need to have like this journey mentality. This is not a one and done kind of thing. But we learn as we go, and we, and we, should have an attitude of curiosity and wondering about these things. And also, it's good to have a partner to talk about these things, somebody that's non-judgmental, that you can ask questions with or vent to, and along this journey.
Yeah, your thoughts about learning so young brings to mind a favorite song of mine, You've Got to Be Taught Before It's Too Late, from South Pacific. And if you're not familiar with it, you should take and find that. Because I'm just wondering in my own mind here how that could be a theme song that could be used in your facilities to help everybody understand that it's too late. By 6 or 7 or 8, they've already been taught. So that song almost prevented that from being allowed to play back in 1948 when that was first announced. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, check it out.
Okay.
And I can talk to you afterwards.
Yes. Another song.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Are there any? Well, Lisa, do you have some follow-up? Because I do think that both of your observations that starting as individuals, also it's what we read or what we need to read. I'm finding that as I read, I've just completed the 1619 project book, and you realize how much history you didn't learn. And we're never going to change things unless we are learning what we were not taught as well as what we were taught. Comments?
I had some piggybacks, back to Dianne too, and having hard conversations with kids about race. And I think also it's important for parents to know that it's okay not to know. It's okay not to know, and it's okay not to have the answer. Let's figure this out together. Where can we get that information together? Because having the conversation and learning together is much better for integrated growth. Yes. You might be able to take that somewhere and do something with it. So being afraid of having the conversation does far more harm, I think, than we ever realized. So that'd be my comment there. Let's figure this out together.
I love that. Oh, I was just saying, I don't have much to add to that. I love what you just said, because that is so true. That's the key right there, is opening up that lifelong conversation.
Well, and often kids just want to know if they're going to be safe and you're going to be safe at the end of the day. They don't want big, complicated, what am I going to do when I'm an adult, or how do I engage in conversations with my preschool friends. They want to know if they're going to be safe and you're going to be safe. So they don't need the big answers.
Dianne, since you do the little moments, the podcast, can you give the listeners who have children, certain ages, some other tips?
Some other tips. So one of the things I like to say too is that, as I mentioned, our children are learning things all over, and so even young children, especially if they have older siblings, they're learning from them as well, and so sometimes they will absorb these things. And so if we're not having these conversations, as Lisa is saying, what they're left to absorb is just our implicit biases. And so, and they do that through what you don't say, and they also do that through your what's happening in your body, in their caregiver's body, I should say, and those other adults and people around them. So So for instance, and this is where the implicitness comes in that you talked about. So if we have, so if you're let's say a mother and you have a 2-year-old and you all are going into the grocery store and you don't realize this, but you do have an implicit bias against, let's say, African American men. You can go into that, and so you're going into that store, you're carrying your 2-year-old, and maybe there's a black man coming out, and you might even, greet him and say hello, but your body tenses up, and you don't realize that's happening, but your body tenses up, maybe you're clutching your purse a little closer, and your child that you're holding is feeling that as well. And so what they learn then is that when I come in contact with a black man, my body tenses up because my body's not safe. And so if we don't have these conversations, that's what they're left with. That kind of thing is what they're left with. And so what I encourage people to do is to be aware of what's happening in your body when you are coming in contact with people or even talking about certain things. Because the opposite is true too. If you are someone that moves easily in and out of being around a wide variety of cultures and people of color, and you've got your young one with you, and your body never changes, it's always relaxed, then that's what the child learns that too. And so, both things are true. And so it's really important to kind of know what's happening in your body. And that's not always an easy thing to do. It's something we all have to learn. But I really do credit a lot of this to Resmaa Menakem's work and his book, which many people are reading now, My Grandmother's Hands. That book actually has some exercises in it that you can go through to learn how to do that body scan.
Lisa, following up on what Dianne has said, can you share what happens to a child when a parent has become depressed due to either one of these pandemics or just life in general? What are some of the things that you work with the children as well as the parent?
I think if a parent is depressed or a parent is anxious, that child is going to do everything they can to get back into that parent's attention span, whatever that happened to be. And as helpers of parents, if parents are coming to us and they're talking about we're struggling in our relationship, then we pare things down and simplify and figure out what can be given in that relationship right now and what can't, and then be clear with that child about what that is so they can predict it. So it's to keep it all down to something simple versus parents are busy right now. They're trying to manage 1,000 things. What's the one thing that child can rely on predictably every day?
And to make sure that everyone understands the variety of challenges that children come to the Harman Center who are 6 and under. What other, some of the children have been born with certain conditions. Some have speech impairment. Can you give us an idea and then how that might have been exacerbated, the struggles in dealing with the children due to the pandemics of the COVID pandemic in particular?
I think that the layers of difficulty that our communities are happening are deep and almost unknown to me as a white woman, frankly, and wouldn't want to speak to somebody else's truth about that. I think that if you're already coming to our center and you're courageous and you're vulnerable and asking for help about a certain condition or a mental health disorder or a relationship issue, you're having to also then manage pandemic and racial equity, then you're really having to figure out what needs are going to come up to the top. And typically safety needs are going to come to the top. Safety is a basic need, just like food and housing. safety is going to come to the top. So how can we create safety in that relationship is where we end up. And it might not be managing a speech deficit. It might be helping that child feel regulated and safe for 1 hour of the day, and that will be our goal. Does that make sense?
Yes. Oh, we have just a few more minutes. Yes.
One question, I keep thinking about our Westminster community, and, you know, so much of our faith traditions are built on stories, and I'm just wondering any thoughts either you have about stories that should be shared in worship or elsewhere in our communities.
That's a really good question. And I like that question because I personally love stories too. I mean, I love to tell stories and I love to hear stories. But I'm thinking about something that you said too about how we don't always know our history. And so, I really believe we should tell those stories. We should tell the stories of things that have happened in this country, how this country was formed and built, truly, the true stories of what's happened with our indigenous population, what's happened with African Americans, what's happened with Asian Americans as they have come to this country. And what's good about, I think, this time in our, in 2022, is that there's actually a growing body of children's books that are that do tell some of these stories. I mean, we always need many more, but it's much more than it used to be, say, when I was coming up. There's a growing body, and so very developmentally appropriate, and also with beautiful illustrations. And so I really like that question because people, I kind of live in a world where data is king, if you will. People want to hear the numbers, and that's important. Don't get me wrong, that's important. I believe in looking at our data and responding to it. But people don't always remember that. They remember the stories, and those stories will you will carry those. I mean, that's how our culture gets continued, is those stories that we pass on from one generation to the next. So thank you for that question.
And I think with that, I want to close and thank both of you for giving us so much of your insights, because I think as members of Westminster, to Phil's comment, it is the stories that touch our hearts as well, coupled with data, but it is always the stories that hopefully help us to grow. Thank you very much, and are we having Social Justice Forum next Sunday?
Yes, we are, and there will be an announcement in the bulletin of the church communication, and I'm sorry, I'm just drawing a total blank right now, but we do have a forum set up for actually the following two Sundays.
Thank you for joining us, and again, thank you, Lisa Brennom and Dianne Haulcy, for helping enlighten us today.
Thank
Very
you.
much.
Thank you.